My name is Harper Reynolds. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life I've been known as the calm one, the reasonable one, the person who doesn't raise their voice, doesn't demand attention, doesn't make scenes. People often describe me as dependable, even-tempered, easy to be around. Some mean it as a compliment. Others mean it as a limitation. I've worked in spaces where consistency mattered more than charisma, where showing up quietly was valued over standing out loudly. In my personal life, I played a similar role. If there was tension in the room, I absorbed it. If there was a disagreement, I softened it. If something hurt, I learned how to swallow it without letting it show. From the outside, that restraint looked like strength, or sometimes like nothing at all. This story isn't about betrayal in the cinematic sense. There's no explosive scandal, no villain pacing in the dark. It's about something subtler and far more common. What happens when peace is maintained by one person choosing silence over truth? For a long time, our marriage felt peaceful because I swallowed everything. That sentence sounds composed, even noble. It took me years to understand the cost hidden inside it. What follows is a slow account of how being underestimated can become a kind of invisibility, and how invisibility can be mistaken for consent. It's a story about small moments, offhand comments, unchallenged assumptions, patterns that form quietly when no one is keeping score. I won't dramatize what didn't happen, and I won't exaggerate what did. There is no revenge arc here, no triumphal music, just clarity, earned the long way. I'm telling a story that's familiar to many who have learned to keep things calm at their own expense. The emotional journey moves from accommodation to awareness, from quiet endurance to deliberate choice. Along the way, I learned that calm can be a currency, and that spending it carelessly leaves you bankrupt in places that matter. You won't hear shouting in this story. You won't hear names raised in anger. What you will hear is the sound of boundaries being discovered after years of being absent. You'll hear how silence, once a reflex, became intentional, and how intention changes the balance of power without announcing itself. If there's a thesis here, it's simple. Calm came at the cost of honesty. And honesty, once reclaimed, doesn't need to be loud to be irreversible. As you listen, I invite you to notice not just what was done to me, but what I allowed, what I misunderstood, and what I eventually chose. This is an account of emotional justice that arrives without spectacle, and of quiet dominance that looks from the outside like nothing happened at all. Have you ever been praised for being easy while quietly wondering what it was costing you? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Useful, present, rarely questioned. I was the person you could count on to remember dates, smooth over awkwardness, and fill in gaps without being asked. In meetings, I was the one who took notes while others debated. In family gatherings, I was the one who noticed when someone felt left out and quietly adjusted the seating or the conversation. In my marriage, I was the emotional regulator, the one who kept things steady. People didn't describe me as passionate or complicated. They used words like stable, grounded, and low maintenance. I smiled when they said it. At the time, I thought that was what maturity looked like. My husband used to tell friends, "Harper doesn't get worked up about things." It was said with affection, almost pride, and I played into it. I learned early that being unflappable earned approval, that reacting less made life easier for everyone else. When disagreements came up, they were framed gently in my direction. "You don't really mind, right?" Or, "You're okay either way." Over time, those weren't questions anymore. They were conclusions, and because I didn't contradict them, they became facts. I was seen as the flexible one, the one without strong preferences, the one whose needs were either minimal or automatically met. No one asked what it took to maintain that impression. No one asked because I never gave them a reason to. At work, This invisibility was rewarded. I was trusted with sensitive tasks because I didn't politicize them. I was given responsibility without authority because I didn't push back. Promotions went to louder personalities, but stability was quietly outsourced to me. I told myself it was fine. I liked being behind the scenes, or at least I liked believing I did. In my marriage, the dynamic was even more pronounced. Decisions were often presented as already half made. Vacations, social commitments, and even long-term plans carried an assumption that I would adapt. And I did. I told myself that love meant compromise, and compromise meant someone had to bend. I was good at bending. What I didn't recognize then was how consistently that bending flowed in one direction. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. There was no cruelty to point at, no single moment that demanded intervention. That made everything harder to name. When you're not being harmed loudly, it's easy to believe you're not being harmed at all. Friends saw us as balanced. "You two are so calm together," they'd say. "No drama." I nodded along. Inside, I carried a quiet inventory of moments where I had chosen silence over clarity. I didn't frame them as sacrifices. I framed them as maturity. The truth is, I was underestimated because I taught people how to underestimate me. Every time I softened my reaction, every time I said it's fine when it wasn't, every time I absorbed discomfort to keep things smooth, I was reinforcing a version of myself that required very little consideration. And that version was convenient. I became the emotional buffer, the margin for error. If something went wrong, I would fix it without fuss. If something felt off, I would process it privately. My inner life became a place no one visited, not even by accident. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being seen as endlessly okay. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, disguised as peace. You stop expecting to be asked how you really feel. Eventually, you stop knowing how to answer. At that stage, I didn't resent anyone. That's important to say. I wasn't keeping score or building a case. I genuinely believed this was who I was. Someone who didn't need much, someone who could carry more. But identity, when left unexamined, can become a cage. I hadn't yet seen the cost of being reliable at the expense of being visible. I didn't see how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, or how often my calm was used to move things along without me. All I knew was that life felt smooth on the surface and strangely distant underneath. This was who I was to them. Not wrong, not mistreated, just quietly edited down to the parts that made everyone else comfortable. And at the time, I would have told you I was fine with that. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was subtle in execution, but because it was subtle in meaning. It arrived wrapped in humor, delivered casually, and immediately followed by a change of subject. The kind of moment that leaves no obvious mark, only a faint internal pause. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal. Conversation drifting, plates half cleared. Someone asked my spouse about a decision we'd made recently, one that had taken weeks of discussion between us. Before I could respond, they laughed and said, "Oh, that was mostly my call. Harper's pretty easygoing about those things." People chuckled. The topic moved on. I smiled too, reflexively, because that's what you do when the room agrees on something about you. You don't interrupt consensus over something that sounds harmless. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't the misrepresentation itself. It was the ease with which it was said, the certainty. As if my role in the decision had been negligible or optional, as if my perspective existed only to rubber stamp a conclusion already reached. I told myself I was being sensitive, that it didn't matter how the story was told in casual company, that correcting it would have made things awkward. And besides, the outcome had been fine. So what was there to correct? That was the logic I used. It was efficient, convincing. Later that night, I replayed the moment, not with anger, but with curiosity. I noticed how no one had looked at me for confirmation. how my silence had sealed the narrative, how quickly a shared process had been simplified into a personality trait. Harper doesn't mind. That was the cut. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough to register. After that, similar moments began to surface in my memory, retroactively illuminated. Times when plans were presented as if they were joint decisions, but the framing always tilted in one direction. Times when my agreement was assumed before it was given. Times when my silence was used as evidence. I didn't confront it. I didn't bring it up later. There was no argument waiting to happen. Instead, I folded the discomfort into my private mental file labeled probably nothing. This is how normalization begins. Not with acceptance, but with dismissal. I started noticing how often my preferences were paraphrased instead of quoted. How often was I spoken about rather than to? It was never hostile. It was efficient. And efficiency, when you're the one benefiting from it, rarely feels wrong. What surprised me most was how alone the noticing felt. Everyone else seemed genuinely unaware. If I had raised it, I imagine they would have been confused, maybe even hurt. I didn't mean it like that. Would have been true. Intent wasn't the issue. Impact was. But impact is harder to argue when there's no visible damage. I began to understand something important in that period. Being calm doesn't mean you're unaffected. It just means you process quietly. And when you process quietly, others assume there's nothing to process. That first small cut didn't change my behavior. Outwardly, nothing shifted. I continued to show up the same way, continued to smooth things over, continued to be agreeable. But internally, a line had been crossed. Not by them, but by my awareness. I had noticed. And once you notice, you can't unsee. Still, I chose silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed in proportional response. I told myself this wasn't worth recalibrating a relationship over. That naming it would create friction where none was necessary. That harmony mattered more than precision. In hindsight, that was the moment I mistook peace for health. The cut healed quickly on the surface. No scar, no reminder. But underneath, something had shifted. A quiet question had been introduced into my thinking. If I don't speak, who defines me? At the time, I didn't seek an answer. I simply carried the question with me like a small stone in a pocket, easy to ignore, impossible to forget. That was the beginning, not of conflict, but of awareness. Once something is noticed, the mind looks for patterns, not intentionally at first, more like a background process you didn't know was running until it started using memory. After that dinner, moments began to line up. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to suggest that what I'd brushed off as a one-off was actually part of a rhythm I'd been keeping time for without realizing it. It showed up in small ways. My spouse would recount our conversations to others, summarizing them in ways that subtly removed my agency. We talked it through would become I decided, or Harper was fine with it. Technically true, emotionally incomplete. My consent was present, but my contribution was erased. At first I corrected nothing. I smiled. I nodded. I let the shorthand stand. I told myself that relationships don't require footnotes, that love doesn't need transcripts. But repetition has a way of reshaping reality. The more often my silence followed these moments, the more natural they became. What began as an assumption hardened into an expectation. I was the one who didn't push, the one who adapted, the one who would understand. Understanding became my assigned language. When I did speak up, softly, carefully, it was often met with surprise, not resistance, just mild confusion, as if I'd momentarily stepped out of character. "Oh, I didn't know you felt that strongly," they'd say. Or worse, "Why does this matter so much?" Those questions weren't meant to diminish me. They were meant to restore equilibrium, to bring me back into alignment with the version of me that caused the least friction. And I let them. I rationalized my way through it. I told myself that being flexible was a strength, that not every preference needed airtime. choosing your battles was a sign of wisdom. All of those things can be true. They can also become shields you hide behind when you don't want to risk being misunderstood. What I didn't realize was how often I was choosing quiet, not because the issue was small, but because the cost of speaking felt disproportionate. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I didn't want to disrupt the image of us as calm, functional, enviably drama-free. So I edited myself. I minimized my reactions. I reframed disappointments as logistics. I told myself that emotional fluency meant not needing to express every feeling. Over time, this became less of a decision and more of a reflex. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as familiarity, as efficiency, as the comfort of someone assuming they know you well enough not to ask. And when you don't correct that assumption, it solidifies. I noticed how often my spouse would speak for both of us in public, not maliciously, confidently. And I noticed how often people deferred to them without checking in with me. It wasn't because they were louder. It was because I had trained everyone to believe I didn't need a voice. The most unsettling part was how normal it felt. There was no moment where I thought, this is wrong. There were only moments where I thought, this isn't worth addressing. And when you think that often enough, you begin to confuse endurance with virtue. I became fluent in self-justification. I told myself I was preserving peace. Those relationships require compromise. That being right was less important than being connected. But there's a difference between compromise and erasure, and I was slowly crossing it without noticing. The irony is that the more I normalized these moments, the less room there was to challenge them. Patterns, once established, resist disruption. When you finally speak, you're not just addressing the present moment, you're contradicting a history you helped write. That realization began to sit heavily with me, not as anger, but as fatigue. A quiet tiredness that came from constantly translating myself into something easier for others to digest. I wasn't being dismissed loudly. I was being summarized, reduced, flattened into a version of myself that fit neatly into other people's narratives. And I let it happen because it felt easier than insisting on complexity. Looking back, I can see how this stage was less about what others did and more about what I allowed to become normal. Disrespect didn't escalate because it didn't need to. It was already accommodated. At the time, I still believed I was choosing this, that my silence was voluntary, that I could speak whenever I wanted. I didn't yet understand how habits of self-suppression quietly rewire your sense of agency. That understanding would come later. Roles don't always come with auditions. Sometimes they're assigned gradually, shaped by repetition and reward, until stepping out of them feels like breaking character. By the time I recognized the role I was playing, I had been performing it for years. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who made things easier simply by being present. In our relationship, that translated into a specific expectation. I would adapt. I would accommodate. I would absorb the inconvenience, so it didn't ripple outward. No one ever said this explicitly. That's what made it so effective. It lived in the assumptions. Who adjusted their schedule? Whose preferences were treated as flexible? Whose emotional responses were managed rather than engaged? I noticed that when something needed to change, the question was never if I could handle it, but how quickly. My capacity was treated as infinite because I had never named a limit. At first, being useful felt good. There's validation in being needed, in being the one others trust to hold things together. But usefulness, when it becomes your primary value, quietly replaces personhood. I was no longer someone with needs. I was a function. In social settings, this role was reinforced constantly. If there was tension, eyes drifted toward me, not to speak, but to stabilize. If someone was upset, I was expected to understand all sides. Neutrality became my brand. People praised me for being so balanced, not realizing how much of myself I was withholding to maintain that image. At home, the role was even clearer. Decisions were filtered through an unspoken hierarchy of inconvenience. If something disrupted my spouse's rhythm, it was a problem. If it disrupted mine, it was manageable. I had demonstrated that again and again. I remember one moment in particular. Not dramatic, just clarifying. We were discussing a long-term plan, something that would significantly affect my routine. I raised a concern, calmly, thoughtfully. The response was a pause, then, "I just figured you'd be okay with it." Not unkind, not dismissive, certain. That certainty landed heavily. Not because the plan was unreasonable, but because my internal world had been edited out of the equation entirely. My role had already been written. My lines weren't needed. That's when it became clear. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being categorized. The role came with benefits. I was trusted, relied upon, rarely questioned. But it also came with constraints. I wasn't expected to change or grow or assert. Stability was my currency, and deviation was treated as disruption. I began to see how the role protected others from discomfort. If I remained calm, no one had to adjust. If I stayed quiet, no one had to reconsider. My predictability made life smoother for everyone else. And I had mistaken that smoothness for mutual respect. The most difficult part to confront was my own complicity. Roles persist because they're reinforced. Every time I chose silence, I confirmed the casting. Every time I prioritized ease over truth, I strengthened the expectation. I wasn't trapped, I was participating. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity, a sobering understanding that if I wanted to be seen differently, I would have to behave differently, and that doing so would unsettle people who had grown comfortable with my compliance. The role I was assigned wasn't malicious, it was efficient, it worked, until it didn't. Because roles that erase parts of you eventually demand too much. They ask you to disappear in increments so small you don't notice until there's very little left. I didn't quit the role that day. I didn't announce a change. But I began to observe it with distance, like an actor realizing the script no longer fits. For the first time, I considered the possibility that being reliable didn't require being invisible, and that thought, once formed, refused to leave. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic line drawn in the sand. In fact, if you had been watching from the outside, you would have seen an ordinary day unfold without interruption. That's what made it unmistakable. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the light comes in softly and nothing feels urgent yet. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my notebook open, not writing anything, just letting the page sit there. I'd started carrying it everywhere by then, a habit formed out of necessity rather than intention. It was the only place where my thoughts didn't have to be edited. My spouse was talking about the week ahead, plans, obligations, expectations. None of it is unreasonable. All of it is familiar. As they spoke, I felt the usual reflex rise in me, the instinct to accommodate, to rearrange my own priorities preemptively. And then something didn't happen. The reflex stalled. I noticed how quickly my mind moved to problem-solving mode on their behalf. How instinctively I began calculating how to absorb the inconvenience. And for the first time, I didn't follow through. I paused instead. In that pause, a question surfaced. Not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. When do I factor myself in? It wasn't the first time I'd thought it, but it was the first time I didn't push it away. I looked at my spouse and realized something quietly unsettling. They weren't excluding me. They were operating within a system that had worked flawlessly for years. A system where my needs were optional because my silence had made them invisible. The realization didn't hurt the way betrayal hurts. It felt colder than that, cleaner, like understanding a mechanism rather than a wound. I listened as they finished talking. I nodded. I responded appropriately. Nothing changed on the surface. But internally, a line had been crossed. For the rest of the day, I moved through familiar routines with a new awareness. I noticed how often I anticipated others' needs without being asked, how rarely I was asked in return. I noticed how my calm was treated as a given rather than a gift. There was no resentment in this noticing, just accuracy. That evening, I sat alone and wrote something in my notebook that I had never written before. Not a complaint, not a plan, just a sentence. Silence has become my default, not my choice. Seeing it in ink made it real. I realized then that my quietness, once a genuine expression of who I was, had been repurposed. It was no longer a trait, it was a tool, one that others relied on, and one I had stopped consciously wielding. The shift wasn't about deciding to speak up more. It was about deciding to stop erasing myself automatically. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I didn't even fully understand what the next step would be. What I did know was that something fundamental had realigned. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider outcomes beyond harmony. I considered what it might cost to remain as I was. I considered the possibility that maintaining peace by swallowing everything wasn't noble. It was unsustainable. That night, lying in bed, I felt an unfamiliar calm. Not the calm of suppression, but the calm of alignment. Nothing external had shifted, yet everything felt different. The world hadn't changed. I had. And that kind of change doesn't ask for permission. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Outwardly, very little shifted. I didn't suddenly start asserting myself in obvious ways. I didn't correct every assumption or narrate my internal process. To anyone watching, I was the same calm presence I had always been. But internally, silence was no longer automatic. Before, it had been reflexive, a learned response that activated before I could evaluate whether it served me. Now, it has become selective, intentional. I began to notice the moment before I went quiet, the split second where I could choose differently. Sometimes, I still choose silence, but it felt different when I did. It wasn't self-erasure, it was strategy. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I started listening more carefully, not just to what people said, but to what they assumed. When decisions were discussed, I noticed which details were presented as fixed and which were framed as flexible. When my name was used, I noticed whether it was as a participant or a placeholder. And I noticed something else. When I stopped filling the space automatically, others filled it for me. Not maliciously, habitually. My spouse began making decisions with increasing confidence, interpreting my quiet as agreement. Friends leaned on me more heavily for emotional labor, assuming my availability. Colleagues continued to delegate without consulting. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. From the inside, I was gathering data. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. It shows you how others move when they think you won't interrupt. What surprised me most was how often that movement revealed expectation rather than consideration. I didn't correct these moments immediately. Not because I was afraid, but because I was learning. I wanted to understand the full shape of the dynamic before altering it. I wanted to see how deeply the assumptions ran. This wasn't passive, it was deliberate restraint. I began documenting, not people's faults, but patterns. When was I consulted? When was I informed after the fact? When was my flexibility praised? And when was it exploited? I wrote these observations down, not to build a case, but to keep myself honest. For the first time, I trusted my own perception enough to record it. Others mistook my continued calm for compliance. I could see it in the way conversations flowed around me, in how decisions accelerated when I didn't intervene, in how comfortable people were assuming I'd adjust. They believed I was still the same because I looked the same. But internally, I was no longer cushioning the impact. I wasn't translating their assumptions into self-criticism. I wasn't blaming myself for feeling uneasy. I was observing, without judgment. This was the beginning of quiet dominance, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of clarity. When you stop reacting, you gain information. When you stop over-explaining, you see who fills the silence and how. I realized then that being underestimated had an advantage. People reveal more when they think you're not a variable. When they believe you won't push back, they stop managing their behavior around you. They show you what they expect you to carry. And once you see that, you can decide whether to keep carrying it. There were moments when speaking would have been easy, when a simple correction could have recalibrated the dynamic temporarily. But I sensed that surface-level adjustments wouldn't address the underlying structure. The role I'd been assigned would remain intact, just slightly modified. I wasn't interested in modification anymore. I was interested in truth. So I stayed quiet, not absent, not disengaged, but present and attentive. I let others continue as they always had. I let the system run without my constant maintenance. And slowly, without confrontation, the weight shifted. Not yet outwardly, but internally, I was no longer bracing myself to absorb it. Silence had become a choice, and choices once recognized can be withdrawn. What they never noticed was how much space their assumptions gave me. When people believe you're passive, they stop monitoring your attention. When they assume you'll adapt, they don't consider that you might be preparing. My quiet had trained them to see me as background, steady, predictable, unthreatening. That perception became my advantage. I didn't announce any internal shift. I didn't test boundaries or issue warnings. I simply continued as I had, outwardly unchanged, while redirecting my focus inward and forward. I began learning deliberately, not in a dramatic way. No late-night schemes or whispered phone calls. Just quiet competence. I paid closer attention to systems I had previously maintained without question. Finances, shared responsibilities, legal frameworks, timelines. I read documents I had once skimmed. I asked neutral questions and listened carefully to the answers. I noticed how much I relied on my organizational labor. How many processes functioned smoothly because I remembered, tracked, and followed up. How much invisible work I did that no one had ever audited because it always got done. I didn't stop doing it. I simply documented it. At work, this was second nature. I had always understood systems. What changed was my willingness to apply that skill to my personal life. I began to see our marriage not just as a relationship, but as an ecosystem, with inputs, dependencies, and unspoken contracts. And like any system, it favored the person least likely to question it. I noticed how information flowed. Who had access to what? Who assumed ownership? Who benefited from ambiguity? None of this was malicious, but it was imbalanced. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was to my quiet inquiries. When you ask calmly, without accusation, people answer freely. They don't sense a threat. They don't guard themselves. I gathered clarity piece by piece. I learned which decisions were truly mutual and which were simply presented that way after the fact. I learned how commitments were made on my behalf without consultation. I learned how often my flexibility had been factored in as a resource rather than a choice. And I learned how easily that resource could be withdrawn. Still, I didn't act. Preparation doesn't always look like motion. Sometimes it looks like patience. They never noticed because nothing broke. The house ran, the schedules are held, the emotional temperature stayed comfortable. I continued to be pleasant, attentive, and engaged. But I stopped cushioning outcomes. If something was overlooked, I didn't quietly correct it. I let it be noticed. If a plan lacked my input, I didn't retrofit myself into it. I allowed the gap to exist. These were not punishments, they were absent. And absences reveal dependencies. My spouse began to experience small inconveniences. Nothing catastrophic, just moments where something didn't go as smoothly as expected. They didn't connect these moments to me. Why would they? I had always handled those details invisibly. Friends noticed I was less available for emotional processing. I still listened, but I no longer carried. I offered reflection instead of resolution. No one confronted me. No one accused me of changing. The shifts were too subtle, too reasonable. That's the thing about quiet preparation. It doesn't announce itself. Internally, I was becoming more grounded. The constant background hum of self-monitoring faded. I wasn't anticipating reactions anymore. I was assessing realities. I realized then that power doesn't always come from assertion. Sometimes it comes from understanding where you're already holding leverage without realizing it. They never noticed because they had no reason to look. They believed the structure was stable because it always had been. They didn't see that the stability depended on my unspoken participation. And I didn't correct that belief. This wasn't about outmaneuvering anyone. It was about seeing clearly, about recognizing that the version of me they relied on was a construct sustained by my effort. Once I saw that, I could decide what to do with it. Preparation for me wasn't a countdown. It was an alignment, a slow, steady shift from self-erasure to self-respect. And the most powerful part was this: I didn't need their permission to do it. The reveal didn't come with a surge of adrenaline. There was no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does, after enough pieces have been laid side by side. I was reviewing documents one evening, not searching for anything in particular, just reading with the kind of attention I had once reserved only for work. Agreements, accounts, timelines, the practical architecture of a life built together. And then I saw it. Not a secret, not a betrayal, just an imbalance so clear it felt almost neutral. I realized how much continuity depended on me, and how little of that dependency had ever been acknowledged. I wasn't just participating in the system, I was stabilizing it. Financially, logistically, emotionally. I had been the connective tissue, quietly absorbing strain so nothing else had to stretch. The leverage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something to wield aggressively. It was structural. If I stopped doing what I did, if I simply withdrew my unspoken labor, the entire dynamic would have to adjust. Not collapse, adjust. An adjustment, I understood, would feel like a loss to those who had benefited most from the old equilibrium. That clarity didn't make me feel powerful, it made me feel calm. For the first time, I could see the situation without personalization. Without the story I had been telling myself about being easygoing or low maintenance. Those weren't traits, they were contributions. And contributions can be renegotiated. What struck me was how long this had been available to me without my noticing. I had been holding leverage simply by being consistent, thoughtful, and reliable, qualities I had never associated with power. But power isn't always force. Sometimes it's centrality. I sat with that understanding for a long time. I didn't rush to conclusions. I didn't imagine outcomes. I just let the clarity settle. There was no urge to confront, no desire to expose. Nothing in me wanted to win. That surprised me. I had assumed that realizing an imbalance would trigger anger. Instead, it brought relief. Because anger requires confusion. And I was no longer confused. I understood now why my silence had been so convenient for others and so costly for me. I understood why the small changes I'd already made were creating subtle friction. And I understood that I had options, real options. Not ultimatums, not dramatic exits, just choices that didn't require permission. That night, I wrote another sentence in my notebook. Simple, unadorned. I don't need to prove my value to protect it. That was the private reveal, not about them, but about me. I had been waiting for acknowledgement that was never coming because the system didn't require it. It required my participation, not my recognition. Once I saw that, the waiting stopped. I began to consider what it would mean to act from clarity rather than reaction, to move deliberately rather than defensively, to choose alignment over accommodation. Nothing changed the next day outwardly, or the day after that. I continued to show up, to listen, to engage. But inside, the ground had shifted permanently. I wasn't angry, I wasn't hurt, I wasn't plotting. I was awake. And that, I learned, is the most destabilizing thing of all, especially when no one knows it's happened. Clarity creates pressure. Not the frantic kind, not the kind that demands immediate action, but a steady internal insistence that something must now be chosen. Once you see the full shape of a situation, continuing as before stops being neutral. It becomes a decision in itself. I was standing at a threshold, even if no one else could see it. There were multiple paths available to me. I could speak up, name the imbalance, ask for recalibration, hope for understanding. I could continue as I was, now with awareness, managing my own expectations instead of the system. Or I could begin the process of disentangling myself from a structure that no longer aligned with who I was becoming. Each option had costs. Speaking up would require vulnerability in a space that had not been practiced in holding it. It would mean explaining dynamics that had developed slowly, without villains or clear moments of wrongdoing. I knew how that conversation would likely unfold. Confusion, defensiveness, reassurance, promises, temporary change, followed by gravitational pull back to the familiar. Staying silent, truly silent, was no longer an option. Silence had become conscious, and conscious silence, when it preserves imbalance, turns into self-betrayal. Leaving, whether emotionally or structurally, was the most drastic option. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was irreversible. It would change the terms of the relationship permanently, even if done calmly, respectfully, without accusation. I didn't rush this decision. I lived inside it for weeks. I paid attention to how my body responded to each imagined path. When I pictured confronting the issue and trying to fix it, I felt a familiar heaviness, the sense of once again managing not just my own feelings, but someone else's comfort. When I imagined staying, fully aware, I felt smaller, compressed. When I imagined stepping away from the role entirely, not in anger, not in chaos, but with quiet finality, I felt grief and relief. That combination told me everything I needed to know. The decision wasn't about punishment or escape. It was about integrity, about refusing to continue a dynamic that required me to disappear in order to function. I chose the irreversible option, not abruptly, not theatrically, but deliberately. This wasn't a declaration. It was a commitment to myself, a decision to stop participating in a structure that depended on my silence more than my presence. I didn't announce it because announcements invite negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating anymore. I understood that once I began acting from this decision, others would feel the effects before they understood the cause. That confusion was inevitable. But clarity, I had learned, doesn't require consensus. The point of no return wasn't a conversation or a document. It was an internal shift. I would no longer trade honesty for harmony. I would no longer make myself smaller to preserve an image of peace. Calm had come at the cost of honesty. I was done paying that price. From that moment on, every action I took would align with this decision. Not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently. And consistency, applied quietly, is one of the hardest things to undo. Once the decision was made, there was no urgency. That might seem counterintuitive. People often imagine decisive moments as catalysts for rapid change, packing bags, drawing lines, forcing conversations. But this decision required the opposite. It required patience. I began moving in silence. Not secrecy in the deceptive sense. There was nothing to hide. But I stopped narrating my internal process. I stopped cushioning transitions with reassurance. I stopped offering emotional previews of what was coming. Instead, I focused on alignment. Practically, this meant organizing my life in ways that no longer depended on constant self-sacrifice. I separated responsibilities that had been informally shared but unequally carried. I reviewed finances with clarity, ensuring transparency without entanglement. I sought professional guidance, not to escalate conflict, but to understand my options and obligations with precision. Everything I did was legal, ethical, and calm. There were no dramatic withdrawals, no sudden absences. Just a gradual reorientation of my energy and attention. Where I had once anticipated needs, I waited to be asked. Where I had once filled gaps, I let them remain visible. This created subtle friction. My spouse noticed that things felt different, though they couldn't name how. "You seem distracted," they said once. I wasn't. I was present in a way that didn't include overfunctioning. I responded honestly, but minimally. I wasn't withholding. I was no longer over-explaining. At work, I applied the same principle. I documented processes I had previously managed informally. I clarified boundaries. I made my contributions visible without self-promotion. This wasn't strategic in the corporate sense. It was consistent with the person I was becoming. The effect was immediate but quiet. Systems that relied on my unspoken labor began to reveal their fragility. Not breaking, but wobbling slightly. No one panicked, not yet. That was the strange part. Even as the dynamic shifted, everyone assumed it would settle back into place. They believed this was a phase, a mood, something temporary. After all, I had always returned to form, but I wasn't planning to. I resisted the urge to explain myself preemptively. Explanation invites reassurance seeking, and reassurance would have pulled me back into the role of emotional stabilizer. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Moving in silence wasn't about control, it was about self-trust, about letting my actions speak in a language I hadn't used before. I noticed how often people project continuity onto others, how uncomfortable they become when someone changes without warning. That discomfort isn't always hostility, it's disorientation. I allowed that disorientation to exist. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was being unfair, if I owed more clarity. But I reminded myself that clarity had always flowed in one direction. I had explained myself for years. This time I was letting reality do the explaining. I wasn't disappearing, I was repositioning. And repositioning doesn't require an announcement. By the time others began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, the infrastructure was already in place. The decision had been operationalized. The old patterns no longer fit. Silence, once a habit of self-erasure, had become a form of self-respect. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, like a system responding to a missing support beam, not collapsing, but redistributing weight in ways that made the absence impossible to ignore. At first, it showed up as an inconvenience. Things that had once flowed smoothly began to require effort. Schedules conflicted, details were missed, decisions took longer. None of it was dramatic enough to prompt alarm, but it was enough to register as irritation. My spouse began asking more questions, not about me, about logistics. Did you handle this? Were you planning to take care of that? The questions carried an assumption that had always been there. The difference was that now the answer wasn't automatically yes. Sometimes I said no, calmly, without explanation. Other times I said, I hadn't planned on it. That sentence landed heavier than it sounded. It disrupted a long-standing expectation. I could see the confusion forming, not anger, not blame, just a quiet recalibration attempt. They were trying to locate the missing piece without yet realizing it was me. Friends, too, began to feel the shift. Conversations that once ended with me offering solutions now ended with reflective silence. I listened, but I didn't fix. I empathized, but I didn't absorb. The absence of my usual emotional labor created a vacuum they weren't accustomed to sitting with. No one accused me of anything. That's important. There was no confrontation because there was no clear offense. I hadn't broken any rules. I had simply stopped exceeding them. The most striking consequence was how quickly discomfort surfaced when my reliability was no longer guaranteed. It revealed how much others had relied on it without acknowledging it. I watched this unfold with a mix of sadness and resolve. Sadness, because it confirmed how unseen I had been. Resolve, because it validated my decision. There were moments when my spouse expressed frustration, not at me directly, but at the situation. Things just feel harder lately, they said once. I nodded. They were right, harder for them. I resisted the urge to step back in and smooth it over. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. Reverting would have erased everything I'd learned. The imbalance was no longer theoretical, it was experiential. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative began to shift internally for them. Without my constant presence as a stabilizer, they had to confront aspects of the dynamic they'd never examined. Responsibilities that had felt shared now felt burdensome. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt distant. Distance, I learned, isn't always created by leaving. Sometimes it's created by staying and no longer compensating. The consequences weren't punishments. They were revelations. They showed everyone involved what had been taken for granted. And once something is revealed, it can't be unseen. By the time the concern became explicit, the window for repair had already narrowed. It started with questions that carried a new tone, not logistical anymore, but emotional. Are you okay? Have I done something? These were asked gently, with genuine confusion. The shift they felt had finally been located, and now they were searching for a lever to pull it back into place. I answered honestly, but selectively. I didn't unload years of quiet erosion. I didn't list examples or present evidence. I simply said, I've been thinking a lot about how things work between us. That answer didn't satisfy them. It wasn't meant to. They wanted a problem they could fix, a behavior they could adjust, a misunderstanding they could clarify. What they didn't yet understand was that this wasn't a miscommunication. It was a structural issue. When someone offers repair after the system has already changed, it often sounds like negotiation. Promises emerge. Awareness sharpens. Effort increases. I watched this happen with a kind of detached sadness. Not because the effort wasn't real, it was, but because it was reactive. And reaction, no matter how sincere, can't undo years of imbalance overnight. They began asking for feedback, inviting me into decisions more explicitly, acknowledging things they hadn't noticed before. Each gesture would have meant everything to me once. Now it felt late. Not because I wanted to punish delay, but because my internal orientation had already shifted. I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I had seen myself. That changed the stakes entirely. I realized then that timing matters as much as intent. Care offered only after withdrawal doesn't land the same way as care embedded from the beginning. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when I understood that no amount of recalibration could return me to the role I had left. Even if the dynamic improved, the cost of staying would remain. They sense this. You can feel it when someone stops trying to convince you and starts trying to understand. Panic crept in, not loud but urgent. Questions came faster. The space between us was filled with unspoken fear. Still, I remained calm, not because I was cold, but because I was certain. Fixing it would have required me to unlearn what I now knew. To pretend the clarity hadn't arrived, to accept gestures that address symptoms rather than causes. I couldn't do that. When you finally stop swallowing everything, your tolerance for partial truths disappears. They asked eventually if I wanted to work on it. The phrase hung between us, heavy with possibility. I didn't say no immediately. I considered it. Not for their sake, but for mine. And in that consideration, I realized something definitive. Working on it would mean staying in a system that required constant vigilance to keep me visible. It would mean monitoring my own disappearance indefinitely. That wasn't repaired, that was maintenance. So when I answered, my voice was steady. I don't think this is something that can be fixed in the way you're hoping. The finality of that statement surprised even me. It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't said to wound. It was simply true. And truth, once spoken, has a way of closing doors quietly but completely. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't resemble anything I had rehearsed in my head over the years. There was no raised voice, no accusations volleyed back and forth, no catalog of grievances laid out like evidence. In fact, if someone had overheard the conversation without context, They might have mistaken it for two people discussing logistics rather than the unraveling of a marriage. We sat across from each other, calm in a way that felt unfamiliar. My spouse spoke first, not defensively, not aggressively, just honestly, for perhaps the first time in a long while. They said they felt like they were losing me and didn't understand when it had started. They asked why I hadn't said something sooner. That question had weight. I took a moment before answering, not to choose my words carefully, but to make sure they were true. I did say things, I said, just not loudly. And eventually I realized I was saying them to myself more than to you. They looked at me, trying to reconcile that with their memory. I could see the gears turning, the mental search for moments they could point to and say, there, that's where we went wrong. But there wasn't a single moment. I explained calmly that the issue wasn't a lack of love or effort. It was a pattern, one that had formed slowly, without intent, but with consequence. I told them that I had learned to be quiet because it made things easier, and that over time, being quiet had turned into being absent. They listened, really listened, and that made this harder, not easier. They apologized, not reflexively, not defensively. They acknowledged things they hadn't noticed, ways they had assumed rather than asked. The apology was sincere. I could feel that. Once it would have cracked me open. Now it landed gently, like something placed on a closed door. I thanked them. Not because it changed my mind, but because it mattered that they finally saw it. Then I said the thing I had been carrying quietly for weeks. I don't want to fight you, and I don't want to convince you of anything. I just don't want to live in a way where my peace depends on me disappearing. There it was. No heat, no drama, just clarity. They asked if there was anything they could do now, anything that would make me stay. The question was honest, and it deserved an honest answer. I told them that if this conversation had happened years ago, it might have changed everything. But now, the work required to rebuild trust in myself, to believe I wouldn't vanish again, felt heavier than the work of leaving. That was the moment the reality settled in, not as devastation, but as acceptance. We talked about practicalities, about timing, about how to move forward without cruelty. There were tears, but they were quiet. There was grief, but it wasn't chaotic. It felt like mourning something that had already ended internally. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic exit. We sat in the silence for a moment longer than necessary, both aware that something irreversible had just been named. And then we stood up. That was the confrontation. Not a collision, but a recognition. Two people finally seeing the same truth, just at different times. After the separation, life didn't suddenly become lighter. That's a misconception people carry, that leaving a misaligned situation immediately brings relief. What it brought me first was space. And space, when you're not used to it, can feel disorienting. I no longer had a role to play. No one expected me to absorb or adapt by default. There was no ambient pressure to keep things smooth. That absence was both freeing and unsettling. I had to relearn myself without the constant calibration to others' expectations. In the beginning, I noticed how often I still anticipated needs that weren't mine to meet, how my body braced for reactions that never came. Old habits don't disappear just because the context changes. But something else had changed too. I no longer ignored those impulses. I observed them with curiosity instead of obedience. I began practicing a different kind of calm, not the calm of suppression, but the calm of presence. When I spoke, I did so because I meant it, not because it would be received well. When I stayed quiet, it was because I had nothing to add, not because I was minimizing myself. People responded differently to me. Some were surprised, some were unsettled. A few drifted away. Others leaned in, meeting me with a depth that had never been possible before. That sorting wasn't painful, it was clarifying. I realized that quiet dominance doesn't come from control or withdrawal. It comes from internal alignment, from knowing what you will and won't carry, from letting your presence be complete rather than convenient. I still value harmony. I still prefer calm over chaos, but I no longer confuse harmony with self-erasure. I no longer offer peace at the cost of honesty. My notebook is still with me. These days, it holds fewer observations and more intentions, reminders of boundaries. I don't need to defend because I honor them consistently. I don't regret the years I spent being accommodating. They taught me discernment. They taught me how easily good intentions can turn into quiet harm when they're not paired with self-respect. Most of all, they taught me that being underestimated is not a weakness. It's only dangerous when you believe it yourself. I am still calm, still reflective, still measured, but I am no longer invisible. And that has made all the difference. There's a particular kind of story that never makes headlines. It's the story of people who don't explode, don't demand, don't dramatize their pain. People who choose patience so often that it starts to look like their personality rather than their strategy. People whose calm is mistaken for comfort. This was one of those stories. For a long time, I believed that love meant making things easier, that maturity meant absorbing discomfort without complaint, that if I stayed reasonable, things would eventually balance themselves out. They didn't. What I learned, slowly, quietly, is that peace built on silence is fragile. It depends on one person continuing to disappear. And when that person finally stops, the peace doesn't break. It simply reveals what was holding it up. There was no villain here. No one set out to harm me. But harm doesn't require intent. It only requires neglect to go unexamined long enough to become normal. The moral of this story isn't leave sooner or speak louder. It's more precise than that. It's this: being easy to live with should never require you to be hard on yourself. When you consistently swallow your truth to maintain calm, the calm becomes hollow. It starts to cost you access to your own needs, your own voice, your own sense of reality. And eventually you have to decide whether that cost is sustainable. For me, it wasn't. Quiet dominance isn't about outmaneuvering anyone. It's about reclaiming authorship over your own life, about letting your actions align with your values without needing applause or permission. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop overfunctioning and let the system respond honestly to your absence. Not to punish, but to see clearly. If there's anything I hope you take from this, it's permission. Permission to notice patterns that don't feel right, even if they look peaceful from the outside. Permission to trust the discomfort that doesn't come with a name yet. Permission to choose honesty over harmony when harmony requires your disappearance. And if you're someone who recognizes yourself in this story, someone who's been praised for being calm, flexible, low maintenance, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been called easy when what you really were was quiet? If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to hear your experience in the comments.